Now that we understand how a relational database works, let's go over and launch our own RDS instance. This is the page you're going to be shown when you launch your first instance. You can go over to Instances and go over to Launch Database Instance. We have many different providers when it comes to selecting a database engine. The first provider we can see is Amazon Aurora, and Amazon Aurora is actually an enterprise solution, so it's going to be used for managing large databases. It has the scaling capabilities, and it has the retention and the reliance of a enterprise database. What this means is it's going to be competing directly with Oracle. And the reason why it is so effective in competition is because it provides basically the same services as Oracle, however, at about a tenth of the cost of Oracle. So that's why Amazon Aurora is a very competitive database, and it is launched through AWS, and many companies are going to be switching over to Aurora as they see this option coming up for the AWS platform. We're going to be going over to MySQL. On MySQL, we have a open source database. So MySQL is going to be a free database that does not require us to purchase a license to it. And that is the reason, obviously, why we're going to be selecting this when we launch our database engine. And the fact that it's free does not actually restrict the capabilities of MySQL. MySQL is actually a very powerful database, and that is why it's used all throughout the world by different companies. And when you're going to be looking at migrating databases over, many times you're going to be presented with MySQL databases. We have different kinds of databases here as well. We have MariaDB, PostgreSQL, and of course we have Oracle. Oracle, we have different kinds of licenses. So we have the Enterprise Edition, Standard Edition, and the different kinds of editions. These are obviously going to be priced at different rates, and we can select the one that we're looking for here. Lastly, we have the Microsoft SQL Server. Again, we have different kinds of editions available to us. First, as we said, we're going to be going over to MySQL and clicking on Select. So it's going to be asking us, do we want to use this database for production reasons? And here we're actually going to be going over to the test and clicking on the next step. Now you can see we have information about the instance. This is a MySQL instance that we're launching here. And if we go over to license, we have the general purpose public license here. This is the free license that is available for MySQL. Now, when it comes to working with licenses, if you have already created or purchased the licenses from different services, you can actually import those licenses onto your database instances, and you can start using those licenses here. You don't have to purchase them again. And this is obviously a case for many different companies. They may already have licenses for 5-6 years. However, they may need to migrate over to AWS and they don't want to repurchase the licenses. Before we move along any further, we're actually going to restrict all the options so that we're only working in RDS free tier. We have now the ability to choose different versions. So when you're going to be importing from a different company, and when you're going to be migrating a company's databases to the AWS platform, they're already going to be having a specific version here. Now, you need to first check whether or not you can go over to the higher versions, because oftentimes these higher versions have not been tested as much. They're not reliable as much as the previous versions here. And you need to make sure that your data and your structures are going to be compliant with any of the versions that you select. So you need to make sure, firstly, you import into the same platform and the same version as the version you have inside your company, and then you can escalate that up and you can upgrade them over to the newer versions. We're going to leave this as the 5.6 version here. Let's go over to the DB instance classes. You can see we have the T2 micro and the T1 micro instance classes. Hopefully this rings a bell, where if you remember when we were working with the EC2 instances, we had different kinds of instances that we could launch. We had micro instances, small instances, large instances, those sorts of things. If I actually untick here and go over to instance class now, you can see all of those other kinds of instances that we had seen before. And basically, if you think about what a database instance is, it's very similar to the servers that we were launching, except the fact is we're only going to be running the database services on that server. So that server is going to be dedicated only to running a database. Let's come back and go to the T2 micro instance. We're not going to be working with multi-AZ deployment. Multi-AZ deployment is basically when you spread out your database into different availability zones. This is done so that, let's say you have some sort of a disaster. In that case, you're going to be able to recover at least some parts of your database. And if you have worked with storing backups correctly, you may be able to construct your database completely together. We'll be going with the general purpose SSD, going over to 5 GBs of storage. Let's define some information about identifying this database. Let's type db-01. You need to make sure you're going to be staying within the namespace that is allowed for the database instance identifier. So anything like underscores and any other characters are not allowed. You can only use the characters, numerics, and the dashes. Here, let's specify a username. A common username for MySQL databases is root, and you can give your own password here. I'm going to be defining one for myself. Let's go over to the next step. Here we have advanced settings, so we can define the network and security settings. You can see as we move along, a lot of this is very much similar to the servers that we had launched before. We're going to be going with the default VPC. We don't want to spread it over to a different availability zone. We don't really care about which availability zone we're using. Here you can specify the publicly accessible or not publicly accessible. So what this means is what is the access traffic inbound that is allowed. So here you're going to leave this as yes. And then we can add the restrictions by creating our own security groups for these database instances. Let's leave this as no preference. And here, instead of creating one own, we're just going to be going with the default VPC. Let's go over to the database name. Let's again call this db-01 and the connection parameters. Finally, we have these three sections where we can specify the backup retention periods. So it is very important to be taking backups of your databases. If you have a backup retention period of 7 days, what that means is you're going to be having, say, a disaster on the 7th day. All the data for days 1 through 7 is going to be destroyed. However, any data before that is going to be saved in the backup, and then you can back up your system to that specific day. If you want to specify a specific backup window, you can specify this as well. This is going to be having automatically scheduled backups, and you can specify them as the start times and the duration for how long the backup goes over. Finally, we have enhanced monitoring, because here too we're going to be having CPU usage and memory usages. You need to be making sure that you're controlling them properly so that you're not going to be overloading your system. And if you have a specific type of query or a specific user who's causing a problem with the system, you can go and tell the user, or you can restrict those here by taking a look at what is exactly occurring inside your system. Here we have information about maintenance. It is important to be able to initiate upgrades, and here if a new version comes along, it is going to automatically do a version upgrade. Many times you might want to go with no, and the reason here is if your data is very much sensitive to the kind of structure that is provided by a specific version, you don't want any sort of upgrades occurring automatically. You want to first test that upgrade on a dev system and then apply it to your QA systems. Here we'll just go with yes, and we're going to go over to launch database instance. Let's make sure we have the specific name here, make this underscore, and go over to launch database instance. Thank you for joining me here, and let's move along.